tall. Oh, he's still about this tall. I see. Good to see you folk again. I was thinking as I was driving up here on this beautiful day today of another time, about 1958. I borrowed $10 from my mother, and I brought a beautiful lady up here, and we got our marriage license. It was a Wednesday. The next Sunday, we brought my first cousin, her first cousin, and one of her friends from church. And we knocked on the first preacher's door we found and said, "We want to get married." He said, "Come down, Mabel, we got another one." It must happen a lot up here. 15 minutes and $15 later, I took home an 18-year-old bride. I had her for 63 years. One day, she found she had cancer and died 9 days later. But you know what? She died smiling. Can you imagine? She said very weakly as she was just about gone, "I don't want to leave you and I don't want to leave my family, but the next person I see will be Jesus." That's the kind of wife to have, I'll tell you. That's the kind of wife to have. Well, today my message is saints in aprons and overalls. What do you think that might be about? Saints in aprons and overalls. Well, sometimes I think we've oversold people on Albert Schweitzer and people like that. Don't misunderstand me. We need Albert Schweitzers, and we'll continue to thank God for them, but they're really all too scarce. But in promoting Christianity, we pastors sometimes have given the impression that you have to go off to Africa or China or some other faraway place to serve if you're going to be a real Christian. Not true. A great many people feel, in other words, that being a good Christian is doing something breathtakingly dramatic. I don't think I've ever done anything dramatic in my life. Many people who day after day live routine, run of the farm or run of the coal mine lives, feel guilty. They say to themselves, in effect, "I'm no Albert Schweitzer. I'm just a housewife or a farmer or an electrician or a miner or a teacher of kids. What chance is there for me to be a real Christian? How can I pack off and go to Africa?" Today I want to probe that concept a little bit. The Apostle Paul was in a position to know who was and who was great among Christians. He knew the heroes and the heroines. He knew real heroism. His long life was packed with the ups and downs and the heartbreaks and victories of living with people. He knew them all in the early Christian church. He knew Peter and James and Barnabas and Mark, etc., etc. All those would have made a who's who in the early Christian church. One of the real heroes of Paul's eyes we've mentioned already today. She was a woman. And we don't even know her name. All we know is her nickname, Lydia. Lydia was the area that she was from. We don't know what her name was. She came from that place in Asia Minor, and so the people in Philippi, Greece, called her that. She was a widow, apparently. She had known her share of sorrow and disappointment. She had responsibilities. She had a family to raise. She had to be the breadwinner. She worked hard, taking up the trade that made her home province in Lydia famous, the dyeing and weaving and selling of purple cloth. She was a religious person. There was no Jewish synagogue in Philippi. You know, it takes 10 men before they will establish a synagogue. There must not have been 10 Jewish men there. So there was no synagogue. But she and other ladies would go out along the river where there was a place where they could pray each Sabbath. Paul and Silas pardon me, Paul and Silas and Luke were on their tour organizing Christian congregations in Greece. My son and the other pastors just got back from Greece right before camp meeting. I always wanted to go to Greece. I wanted to know if turkey was really fried in Greece. Never been over there to ask that question. Usually they hunted up a synagogue and preached there first, but in Philippi, they could not find anything remotely resembling a synagogue. Then someone remembered that handful of women who held a quiet prayer meeting outside the city every Sabbath. Paul and his party met those few women, and Lydia and her friends became the nucleus of a strong group of believers of Jesus Christ who founded a Christian church in Philippi. Now, I would like to try to bring 3 lessons from this story of Lydia and the foundation of that church in Philippi. And you know what my son told me when he got back from over there? Over here we have a town called Philippi. We call this one Philippi, except the people over there call it Philippi. I don't understand everything I know. That's one of the things I don't understand. Anyway, the first of these lessons shows us that God uses women for some of his greatest work. Until Jesus came into the world, women's place in society was strictly that of something to be owned and used. A woman was either man's plaything or his drudge. But the New Testament reveals that God selects women for some of the most important jobs. It's tremendously significant that God entrusted the very most important thing that ever happened on this earth to a young woman. For it was an ordinary young housewife named Mary who was given the responsibility of giving birth to the Son of God and raising him to manhood. We men often think the biggest, most important matters are concerned with such things as building a steel mill or being president of a nation or organizing and supervising a very complicated process. But that's not true. With God, people are the most important thing. I live yet with Marty's 89-year-old sister. I promised Marty I'd take care of her, and I'm trying my very best. If you can take care of an 89-year-old lady, she thinks she's taking care of me. Well, anyway, yesterday, she and I were talking about something, and she said, she's talking about her younger brother who lives nearby who has, well, his garage and my garage are about the same. They're for items, not cars. Well, anyway, she looked at me thinking about her brother, and she said, you know, things are not important. People are important. That's true. You can have all the things in the world, but if nobody cares for you and you care for nobody, your things aren't getting you anywhere. Well, anyway, this dear lady named Lydia was a very important person. More often than not, it's a woman who sees and takes care of people as, well, as people. For instance, the capacity of a teacher or a nurse, social workers, and of course, mothers. A census taker making his rounds called at a home where he asked the woman of the house what her business or occupation was. She wearily just said, oh, I'm just a housewife. Just a housewife. Actually, she wields more influence in a community than sometimes bankers or plant managers or even government officials. She has power and influence over people. Her own family, her neighbors, and to a degree, that would make a Madison Avenue advertising agency envious. People listen to a lady. Usually. Except the husband. God picks out the Lydias for some of the biggest jobs. Now, the second thing I'd like to point out is that we can learn from this story, as Lydia, is that God uses ordinary people for his most important work. Too often we have mistaken the idea that it's only the big names, the headline makers, who do the important things. Well, it's true. We do need people like St. Paul or Mark Finley or Doug Batchelor or some of those kinds of people. They have their place. But the Lydias, the Priscillas, the Aquilas, and the Murphys have their place too. Our world would be much poorer without them. When I was the vice president of the Texas conference, I would go around to the many churches. Oh, Pastor, it's good to see you. Where's Martha? And here, I would go around to the churches here and the same thing. It's good to see you. Where's Martha? Marty had an ability to just be herself. It was never about her. It was about everybody else. And people knew that. Well, here's a few other Lydia types that I knew personally. A colporteur one time came through the countryside near where I live and sold this very book right here to a lady. Her name was Bertha Pearl Schaeferman. That's my wife's paternal grandmother, her father's mother. This very book right here. Patriarchs and Prophets in the green binding. You've had to say things like that. So have I. She bought the book. She read, learned about the Sabbath, said to her husband words to this effect, you know, Saturday is the Sabbath, and we're going to have to start observing the Sabbath. He, being a German, said, I work at the railroad 5 days a week. I'm a farmer on the weekend. I need both days. We just can't do that. And she, not wanting to cause a big fight in the family or, anything like that, realized that her husband was the head of the house. That's the way it was in that house. So she took that very book and put it on the shelf and went about her normal activities. It wasn't too many years after that. He was a foreman on the track on the railroad. There was a terrible accident. He was killed. It was a very sad occasion in the whole family because he was greatly respected. But we live until we die. I see people in here that I know have experienced the same kind of thing. Well, she remembered the book, and she took the book back off the shelf and she read some more. And then somehow she heard that there were people over in Fairmont that went to church on the Sabbath. And so she got on the train. Since he was a railroader, she had a free pass. She could ride on the train free. And so she went over, started going to church in Fairmont. Eventually, a person came through and held a series of meetings. She was baptized. And as far as I've been able to determine, she was the first Seventh-day Adventist in Taylor County. Then she began writing the conference president when she found out he was down there. When are you going to start a church in Grafton? When are you going to start a church in Grafton? Letter after. I even found some notes there when I was in that office. He got in touch with the Clarksburg pastor and said something to this effect. Will you get this lady off my back? She keeps writing me these letters saying, when are you going to have a church in Grafton? So, would you take your members over to Grafton and hand out Bible course enrollment cards and then follow them up because they have no one over there to follow them up? Well, the dutiful pastor and his members did that. And then that evangelist came and with that pastor's help, held a series of meetings in Grafton over on the west side in the storefront. It was empty. 32 people were baptized, and that's what started the Grafton Church. Now, I'm going to step aside and tell you something that most people don't know. There's people in Grafton that greatly appreciate what Clarksburg did. Clarksburg's trying to build a new church. They rented for years, and finally, they were given 6 months. They had to come out of their Presbyterian church, but they had no place to go. So they bought a piece of ground, and they're building a church. A couple of people in Grafton knew about that and asked me if I would go over and tell the story to those that didn't know about how they were the ones that started the work in Grafton and give them this. But don't let them know who these 2 checks are coming from. Well, how am I going to do that? How do you hand a check and say, don't read it? All of a sudden, bing, a light came on. So I took it to the treasurer in Grafton, and I told her, I said, I would like to have you put these 2 checks in your account and write me a check equal to the 2. I can't do that. Yes, you can. No, I can't. Yes, you can. No. Around, around, around. She said, I'll call the treasurer at the conference. I said, good. The treasurer of the conference said, of course you can. I felt good about that. Well, anyway, then I was able to take a check, put it in an envelope, and go to a social that they had, a bonfire out there on the new property, and tell them that story and hand the treasurer this envelope. He opened it up, just stood there. Somebody said, what's wrong? He said, this check is for $30,000. The 2 checks that were given me, one was $5,000, one was $25,000. God has a way. He knows. People began crying because they were really hard up for money. That church is not a big church, and there's not very many wage earners in the congregation. But they went out in faith, and they're building a church. Now, who are those 2 people? People like Lydia. I'm not giving you their names either. I happen to know their names because I had the 2 checks. God has people out there that are the kind of people that make change and difference in the world. They just don't want anybody to know who they are, and that's okay. We don't need to know everybody's name. Well, anyway, this lady got the church started in Grafton by writing the conference president over and over again. Now, have any of you ever heard of Claire B. Claire Bee? If you go to Grafton High School, there's 2 gymnasiums, the old one on the left and the new one on the right. The one on the left says Claire B. Fieldhouse. If you go from west side to the south side across the river in Grafton, there's a bridge there, Claire B. Memorial Bridge. Mm-hmm. Who is this guy? Well, it so happened that he grew up there, became a tremendous athlete, became a coach, and has the greatest winning percentage of any college coach in history. 86.2% of the games they played, they won over several years. You know, why do I say that? Well, because the house that he grew up in was purchased by the Grafton congregation, and that's where they started their church, was in the B home, which is no longer there. It's torn down now. But, you know, God has a way of getting things going, and it doesn't have to be important people. The people in that church paid for that building by making raised donuts and selling them for a nickel a piece. 60 cents a dozen. I mean, big raised donuts. And I can remember helping. They called me the Big Dipper. because I took the donuts into that kind of sugary water and glazed them, and hung them up on a pegboard. I had just about this much of the help to build and buy that church. Well, anyway, it doesn't take very, very important people to do very, very important things. And some of the most important people in this area is sitting right here. You may not know it. What God has planned for you, I don't know, and you probably don't know. But God knows. Sometimes we come to a fork in the road, and like Yogi Berra said, if you come in a fork in the road, take it. But depending on which way you go, pray that God will guide you, and away you go to accomplish wonderful things. Now, there's another. Marty's mother, 4'10½". I had her funeral. Hardest funeral I ever had. I sang at my mother's funeral. Not that I wanted to, because Dad said, your mother thought you could sing, so sing. So I chose a song that nobody knew, so they couldn't find a music to it. Some little piano player out in a country church had the song, so I had to sing it. And when I stood up to sing the song, looking right down into the casket where my mother laid, she's 54 years old. She died very suddenly. It was like I was in the shower. I had no negative emotions at all singing that song. People on the front row, my family, were crying. I had a 6'4" cousin. Tears just running down his face. I went down and sat down. When I finished, he said, how could you do that? I said, I guess God helped you in times like that. Well, anyway, I had a real struggle with Marty's mother because she had become my surrogate mother. I loved her with an everlasting love, and she knew it. I'd write her notes when I traveled all over the place. I'd try to bring her a gift, and she'd say, I've got too much stuff now. Then I started bringing her a rock. This rock is from Toronto. Oh, I've never had a rock from Toronto. She don't mind having a rock. This rock is from Mexico. Oh, this rock is from Cuba. This rock is from... I brought her rocks from all over the world. She still has some of them. She's no longer there, but there are still some in the laundry room on the shelf with names on them where they came from in her handwriting. Well, she would ask me to take her out in the country. Just take me somewhere out in the country. I want to go door to door and hand out literature. Any particular place? Well, this place or that place. She didn't really care as long as there's people there. So I'd go and follow along slowly, and she would go to these country houses and talk to them and hand them literature. Next thing you know, I'd be back visiting her again. She'd say, can we go out and give out literature today? You see, she never got her driver's license. She only went to the 8th grade. She thought she didn't have a whole lot going for her. But she gave me a book one time, The Works of Josephus. She had read that book and had underlined quite a few places and notes on the side. How many of you have read the Works of Josephus? Most of us don't even know who Josephus was. He was a Jewish historian in the times of Jesus. She was well read. But, the day came when she died. I had that funeral, as I said. At the viewing, the place was crowded. The funeral director, which I had known for some time, said to me, he said, now, Randy, there won't be very many people here tomorrow. It's the middle of the week and people have to work. That's why so many come out at the viewing the night before. I said, oh, I understand. The next day, there was even more people there. Every chair was filled, and there's a steps going up to the second floor. People were on that like pews. clear to the top. The funeral director came to me and said, "Who was this little woman?" I said, "She's my mother-in-law." "I know that, but all these people." It's because of not what she did, but who she was. People loved her just like I did. Ordinary people like you and me and Mary Susan, that was her name, do unordinary things, and God blesses them. Several years ago in Pasadena, California, a young Negro boy began to get into trouble with the law. He had a strong grudge against society for some reason, and he was headed for real danger. He came before a judge, and a wise man asked a young Methodist minister named Carl Downs to take personal responsibility for helping that boy overcome his bitterness. The pastor agreed and spent a great deal of time with that boy. And the result? That boy overcame his bitterness, and he turned out to be a credit to his race and to the sports world, and you probably know his name. His name was Jackie Robinson. Very, very famous baseball player. By the way, what was that preacher's name that turned him around? See, that's what I mean. There are some people who do wonderful things, but nobody remembers them. And that's okay. His name was Carl Downs, by the way. Carl Downs, but he was just another Lydia, one of those quiet people who moved the work forward somehow. Jesus Christ deliberately picked out 12 ordinary men, and he said, in effect, "Give me 12 ordinary men and I'll change the world." And he did it, even with 11. None of them was a headline maker or a big name, but on the contrary, they were common, run-of-the-coal-mine people. Whenever any Lydia, no matter how uneducated or unknown, commits his or her life to Jesus, things begin to happen. That person becomes a dynamo for God, radiating power and love in a way that affects his family, his or her neighborhood, and something wonderful happens to their church. These unknown and unsung heroes and heroines, these Lydias, Priscillas, Aquillas, Martys, and her grandmother, whose name was Bertha Pearl. If you have a daughter, name her Bertha Pearl. Those names have disappeared. And her mom's name was what? Mary Susan. I got a golden retriever puppy one time, and Marty's older brother was there, and I said, "I got to name this female dog. What in the world can I name it?" He said, "Name it Mary Susan." "Name a dog after your mom?" "She'd be proud," he says. And she would have been. So I ended up with a dog named Susie. I figured Mary Susan was a little too formal. But Susie was a great dog. When I worked wood, she worked wood. If I was out cutting brush, she'd be chewing on briars. If I was in my wood shop building something, she'd be taking a piece of wood and chew it to pieces. She thought whatever I did, she had to do. Great dog. Thirdly, Lydia's story proves that God never forgets anyone who serves him. We've said that we do not even know Lydia's real name. She went by the name of her home country. We had a large family working at Miracle Meadows from the island of Tonga in the South Pacific. Now, their names are not Peter, James, and John. You know, they had their own names. Some of them I could hardly pronounce. So instead of calling them by their real name, I just called any one of them Tonga. And they loved it. Tonga, they'd say back to me. Some of these guys were, you know, I was expecting to see them with bones in their nose when they came, but they didn't. They were nice Christian people. Tonga. And then, you know, Americans who travel in Europe are often called Yank. And I had a friend growing up who lived next door to me. He was from Scotland. Everybody called him Scotty. Now, Scotty was unique. He had a big white mustache, but he liked to make people happy. He was just a happy-go-lucky kind of a guy. So on Easter, I don't know how he did it, but he made his mustache about the color of your hat, bright yellow. And he would go to town. And people would go by him and he'd say, "Happy Easter, Happy Easter." Everybody knew Scotty because he was a happy-go-lucky somebody. Christmas, he took that big white mustache and made half of it green and half of it red. And he'd go to town and he'd say, "Merry Christmas, everybody. Merry Christmas." You know, people like that. I don't know that Scotty ever did anything that was really worth talking about, except that he made people happy wherever he went. I loved Scotty. He and I sat and he would tell me tales. I'm telling you, he could really tell tales. Whether they're true or not, I have no clue. Anyway, Lydia's not mentioned ever again in the book of Acts. Paul doesn't mention her by name in the letter that he wrote a few years later to the church in Philippi. Now, I don't know, had she moved away? Was she dead? Or was she just one of those quiet, humble people who was there all the time, effectively advancing the cause of Christ, of whom no one ever thought to single out particularly? We'll never know. Lydia might have been forgotten by history, but she was not forgotten by God. Sometime back, a book was published listing the 100 most important people in the world at that time. When I read that in Time magazine, I said to myself, says who? I mean, you take 50 people and say who's the 100 most important people in the world, you wouldn't get the same list. There'd be many different lists. Well, then, of course, there was a book that's also famous in this country, Who's Who in America. I wonder if your name's in there. I know mine's probably not. I haven't done anything to make me who's who. This supposedly lists those who really count for something in the American scene. We think those books are places where our name perhaps would be well to be listed. I mean, you're important to you. I'm important to me. That's about all, just us. But most of the names that I'm interested in are those who's in God's book, the book of life. This is the role of those who trust in God and effectively serve Him. Most of the names in God's memory book, I'm sure, are not famous or well known. They're just common, ordinary people, like the ones we have living around us or with us. The book is crowded with names like Lydia and Priscilla and Aquila and Marty, and those quiet, humble people who do the biggest jobs and nobody knows it. We think that because our contemporaries here on earth will remember us for a while after we're gone. But will we be remembered differently? Think about your great-grandparents. There's 8 of them, you know. Great-grandparents now, not your grandparents. What are their names? Do you know those 8 people's names? They're related to you. I can't remember all of mine. Of course, you have a better brain than I have, probably. I am not an old man. I've just had 84 birthdays, that's all. Now, thousands of years ago, a dictator of the wealthiest, most powerful nation in the world concentrated all the nation's energies on making sure that he would be remembered. For 20 years, 120,000 men slaved, dragging enormous limestone blocks, averaging 2.5 tons each. They piled over 2 million of them into a gigantic symmetrical heap, 482 feet high. It was undoubtedly the greatest attempt ever made by anyone to perpetuate their memory. You can still see the remains of what that dictator had built. I've had the privilege of going there, even going inside, and going to the king's chamber, seeing the sarcophagus that he laid in. He's not there now. He's in the museum. I saw him over there. He wasn't a whole lot to look at by then. Kind of looked like a mummy. Anyway, only the history buffs among us can remember that his name was Cheops. I don't know anybody else named Cheops. That's why I can remember his name. But few, if any of us, can remember what he ever did or what he stood for. Human memory is fickle. The only one whose memory is not fickle is God, and the only one whose memory does not dim is God. Indeed, he tells us throughout the Bible that he never forgets his own. Isaiah 49:15 says, "Can a woman forget her sucking child, that she should have compassion on the son of her womb? Yea, they may forget, yet I will not forget thee." God sent us Jesus to remind us and show us that he can never forget those who trust in him. When people like us crucified Jesus, you hear what I said? It was people like us, just ordinary people, that somehow got caught up in the crowd and began yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him." He should have given the world up right there. But the truth of the matter is that God has not and will not give us up. He will not forget us. He raised up Jesus from the dead, sent him back as the living Lord. You may be a Lydia. You may be a forgotten heroine or a hero by this world's standards, but you are never forgotten. You are constantly remembered and everlastingly loved by the God and Father to whom you belong. If you've known me very long, you know that I love books. I love to read. I read every day. Marty said I had too many books. That's when I only had 6,000. I got more than that now. A good book is like a good friend, and you can't have too many good friends. Isn't that right? Well, there's a book by Alexander Irvine called My Lady of the Chimney Corner. I'm sure all of you have read that. In this story, he tells of his boyhood in poverty-stricken Northern Ireland. It was in the 19th century, and on one memorable scene, he tells how a rebellious hoodlum of a boy from his village frequently resents all restrictions in his godly home, and one night he sneaks out and runs away. His saintly mother is left alone and heartbroken. The village only laughed, saying, "Well, who cares? That boy wasn't any good anyway." But each night, that boy's mother goes through a costly ritual. She lights the stub of a candle and sets it up in the window, waiting for her boy to come home. Candles were expensive, and she was very, very poor. Years passed. The son had never been heard from. Only the old-timers even remembered him, and even those seldom thought about him. He was completely forgotten, except for an old lady sitting night after night by the window with that bit of a candle burning. No one knew how many meals that lady had to skip just to afford the unheard-of luxury of having that simple candle burning each night. As time went on, people who had known the son or heard of him only saw this frail, broken lady going about her daily activities and sitting by her window night after night. They thought that she was just an odd old lady. Everyone else had forgotten. But how could a mother ever forget? But even this love is nothing compared to the way God loves you and me, his children. He lighted the window of our home in him because he is the light of the world, showing he always remembers, showing he always is there to welcome us home. Now the question, dear one, have you strayed away from God? Have you been ignoring his will for you? Have you been putting off making a full surrender to him? Don't you think it's time to come back home? God has a light in the window. It's not a candle, it's himself, the light of the world. Some of us think, well, I have other things to do and it's inconvenient. Since when has the cross ever been convenient? I urge you today decide, I'm going to give my life completely to Jesus. I'm going to serve him, even if it's just like a Lydia or an Aquila or a Priscilla. We know their name. Well, we don't know Lydia's name. We know where she's from, but we know nothing much about them. I want to pray for you. Heavenly Father, I'm so thankful that you remember who we are, where we were born, and all the events of our lives, and still love us. So often we've wandered away. We've done things on the other side of the hill or in the dark of night or somewhere where we think nobody noticed. But you were there. You watched the whole thing. So, Father, I ask, number one, that you forgive me and help me to come back into a full surrender to you. And I pray for each of the folk here, and those who listen, and those who watch, and those who have wandered, that they too might come home. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.